and nucleic acid PowerPoint like I did earlier for carbs and lipids. So proteins are made of monomers called amino acids. Just like carbs and lipids were made of their own building blocks, their own monomers, proteins are made of amino acids. And proteins are the most diverse of all the macromolecules. What does that mean? That means that they come in all different shapes and sizes. Our body has over 100,000 different proteins, and all of them have different jobs inside our body and inside our cells. So, as I mentioned, they have lots of different functions, different jobs. One example is proteins act as enzymes. For example, we have an enzyme called lactase that helps us break down the protein in milk. So enzymes control the rate of reaction. In the case of lactase, it helps speed up the digestive process after we eat, like cheese or milk. That's just one example. Another example is proteins help form our bones and muscles. So if you want to look like this young lady right here, you got to take in a lot of protein into your diet because our muscles are built of protein. Um, and proteins also help transport things in and out of cells. So you can see here in this picture, we've got our little phospholipids. Those are lipids, but this thing right here, this yellow thing, and this blue thing, these are proteins embedded in that cell membrane. And they're kind of the gateway for things to get in and out of the cell in between those phospholipids. All right, and at the bottom, you might not be able to see it. It says help fight diseases. That's because proteins also form antibodies. So that's just another example of things proteins do. Antibodies help prevent infection. So I mentioned that proteins are made of amino acids. So these amino acids are linked together by something called a peptide bond. So a peptide bond is this special bond only found in proteins, and it only links amino acids together. So amino acids link together to form these long chains. Each one is connected by a peptide bond. And together, when you get a long chain of amino acids, you get something called a polypeptide. So the monomer of a protein is an amino acid. They're linked together by peptide bonds, and the polymer, when you link all those together, is called a polypeptide. All right. So here's a nice little visual. This thing that looks like a necklace, that is a long chain of amino acids. So that whole thing, that whole chain is called a peptide bond. And that kind of folds into like this three-dimensional shape that becomes the protein. Okay, so for example, if we zoom in on this little amino acid chain here, this polypeptide, this stands for one amino acid. This is leucine. This is another amino acid, serine, cysteine. I don't expect you to remember every different name of every different amino acid, but all I want you to know is that each of these is an amino acid. They're the building block of a protein, and this whole thing is called a polypeptide. I don't know why it says honors only. Anyway, key point. So I mentioned that there are a lot of different kinds of proteins. They all have different jobs. That's because they come in all shapes and sizes. So it's a very diverse group of organic molecules. There's a million, from all the different antibodies to all the, from all the proteins in our cells. They all come in different shapes and sizes, and that's because they all have different jobs. So one key point is that it's the shape of the protein that determines its function. Just like the shape of a key determines which lock or which door it can open, the shape of a protein determines how it works in the body. All right. So just to review, we talked about with proteins. Proteins are an organic molecule. They're made of building blocks, monomers called amino acids. Those are linked together using peptide bonds, and together they form a polymer called a polypeptide. Then that polypeptide twists and folds into this three-dimensional shape, like this purple looking thing, and that is a protein. This little guy right here, I actually recognize that. That's hemoglobin, which is the protein in our red blood cells that oxygen attaches to. So that's how we breathe. Um, Nucleic acids. So my personal favorite, this guy right here, that's DNA. So there are two types of nucleic acids. There's RNA and DNA. So what do RNA and DNA do? They store and transmit genetic information. So we get our DNA from our parents. That's kept in the nucleus of our cells, packed into chromosomes. Um, we're going to talk more about RNA when we do genetics. All I care about that you know is that RNA is another type of nucleic acid that's related to DNA. It's like the stepbrother. You know what I mean? We're going to talk more about that later. And yeah, they've got, you remember CHNOPS, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, nucleic acids also have phosphorus. I don't really care if you memorize that. Just, you know, it's the same basic elements. So what is the difference with DNA and RNA? So I'm not really going to talk about what they do, as long as you know they both store and transmit genetic information. But DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So there's the D, there's the N, there's the A. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. So there's the R, there's the N, there's the A. So again, they're both nucleic acids. The only difference is that DNA, well, one of the only differences, DNA uses this sugar embedded in the side of it called deoxyribose. So remember, carbs always end with ose, and RNA uses the ribose sugar. They're not really that important. They're just kind of like the glue that holds the nucleic acids together, but they just use different ones. So DNA uses this one that starts with a D. RNA uses this one that starts with an R. All right. We're going to get back to the rest of that. So there's a video here. I'll play it briefly. It wouldn't play on an AirPod, but since I'm using Google Slides, this will play. So this shows, before I play it, let me pause. There we go. Nope, no. I don't know how to, let me just, no, that did not just happen. Let me go back to present mode. Okay, so I wanted to introduce the video before I played it. So each of these little things represents a nucleotide because the monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. So just like amino acids build proteins, nucleic acids nucleic acids are built of nucleotides. So this is going to show DNA being made. This is not actually DNA. It's just a artist's, just a computer animation. But it's going to show different nucleotides getting attached to form the polymer that we know as DNA. All right, so here we go. So that's one nucleotide, bam, 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 until you get a long, long chain of millions of nucleotides, and that forms our chromosomes. All right, guys. So again, the monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. All right, now here's the tricky part. This is why nucleic acids are the most complicated. Because within the nucleotide, you've got three parts. All right? You've got a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. All right, that's part of this monomer. Here's a picture of the monomer. All right. These two are the sugar and the phosphate aren't that important. Again, they're just kind of like the glue that helps DNA keep its shape. All right. So DNA uses the sugar deoxyribose. RNA uses ribose. All right. Not a big deal. That's just how they get their name. A phosphate is just a phosphorus atom with a few oxygen atoms attached to it. Just so you know, you don't have to. Just so you know what that means. That weird word. Again, not that important right now. This one, the base, is the most important because the bases carry the genetic information. Okay, so DNA uses 4 different bases. All right, so each nucleotide has one base. It can either have a T, an A, a C, or a G. Okay, They all have one. T stands for thymine, A stands for adenine, C stands for cytosine, G stands for guanine. You don't need to know that right now. We're going to cover that when we talk about genetics. All I want you to know is that the nucleotide has a part called a base, and it's the key to the genetic code. Why is that? Because the order of bases in your DNA or in the DNA of all living things determines determines who they are, what they are. It determines their traits, their genes. Okay, so let me give an example. Let's say even though your genetic code is again like a million bases long, let's just simplify and say my DNA code, my genetic code is only 5 bases. So let's say mine is TTACG. My wife's might be CCGAT. So she's got a different genetic code because her nucleotides have a different sequence of bases or a different order of bases. Okay, so how do And they use genetics to solve crimes. So if they find DNA at a crime scene, they have a machine that reads the bases, the order of bases. It's called a DNA sequencer, and it reads the genetic code just like you read a sentence in this PowerPoint, and it then it tells you the order of the bases, and then they'll match that sequence of bases up with any suspects that they might have, and they'll see if they match up, and then they have their their man or their woman, whoever committed the crime. But the key is to find DNA at the crime scene, which is not always easy. So bases again, it's the order of bases that determines the genetic makeup of an individual living thing. The order of the bases. Okay. Okay. So let's go over that again because that was hard. Okay. So there are two nucleic acids. There's DNA and RNA. Each nucleic acid consists of a monomer called a nucleotide. Each nucleotide has three parts: a sugar, a phosphate, and a base. The bases, there are four different ones. So a nucleotide can have a T, an a C, or a G. And it's the order of those bases that determines which genes you have, what traits you have, who you are, and no one has the same bases in their DNA as you unless you have an identical twin. Okay, so your genetic code is unique, completely unique to every human on this planet. It's impossible for anyone to have the same genetic code as you unless you have an identical twin. Okay, um, even if your parents had your parents would probably have to have something like, I did the math once, it's something like 64 billion kids before they had another identical. So it can't happen, um, which I think is kind of cool. So again, there are two types of nucleic acids: there's DNA and RNA. Another difference I didn't mention is that DNA is called a double helix because it has this helical shape. It's like a spiral staircase, or if you took a ladder and you twisted it around. So that's where the helix comes from. It's called a double helix because there are two sides. There's one side here. There's one side there. RNA is only single stranded. So it's like if you took a spiral staircase or a ladder and you ripped it in half. It's only got one side. Okay. And the other difference is that RNA uses the ribose sugar. That's why it's called ribonucleic acid. And DNA uses deoxyribose. Another third difference, which we're going to talk about more when we cover genetics, but I mentioned that DNA uses ATCG. Um, RNA, instead of using a T, uses a U. So it has one base that's different. from DNA. So for every nucleotide in RNA, it can be either they can either have an A, a U, a C, or a G. The way I teach my students to remember the letters of the bases is for DNA, it's apples in the trees, cars in the garage, because obviously apple and tree start with an A, a T, and cars and starts with a C, and garage starts with a G. And then for RNA, one of my students said animals underground, cars in the garage. If that helps, I don't know. That probably just confused you, but all right, guys. So let's just review everything we learned about this whole unit. What do you get when you mix lots of sugars together, which are the monomer of a carb? You get a polysaccharide. Yeah. Um, what do you get when you have three fatty acids? What's that name called? It's called a fat molecule or a triglyceride. So amino acids are linked together. You get a polypeptide because they're linked together by a peptide bond. And I don't have a nucleic acid one, but it's nucleotides linked together to form a nucleic acid. All right, guys. Um, yeah, if you want to take a picture of this chart, it's really helpful. It's like all the four organic molecules, aka macromolecules, what they do in the cell, the monomer, the building block, and what the polymer is called, and then an example. So there's no like fancy name for the polymer of nucleic acid. It's just a nucleic acid, and there are two examples: DNA and RNA.